speaker today is Henry Reynolds. Henry is a lecturer in the Department of History at the James Cook University in Townsville. Henry is well known throughout Australia for his work in the area of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs and has published many papers dealing with the issue of native title both in the Australian context and with respect to overseas experience. Henry will hopefully clear up a lot of misconceptions about native title and its economic and social impact. Henry has indicated that he will be pleased to take questions after his paper and will be also available later in the afternoon during the plenary session. Thanks, Henry.
Thanks very much. I was asked to speak about native title, what it means and what it doesn't mean. I suppose the easiest way to do that is to contrast native title with the doctrine of terra nullius, which native title replaces, overturns. To do that, I'll look at 6 separate points, which I have variously called sovereignty, land use, property rights, traditional association, compensation, and politics. So let me go through those in turn. I still won't have covered the whole field by any means, but hopefully I'll provide at least some explanation of what native title actually is all about. Native title then has to be seen as in direct contrast with terra nullius. It arose because Eddie Mabo said, I own my land, and my family always have done, even though I don't have any piece of paper, I don't have any title from the Crown. The Queensland government said, no, Eddie Mabo and the others don't own their land at all. All the land is Crown land that belongs to the state of Queensland, and that's been the case since Murray Island was claimed in 1879. So the two positions are diametrically opposed. This was illustrated for me, I think most graphically, on the last day of the hearing, and I was actually in the High Court sitting next to Eddie. And the Queensland Solicitor General was giving his final submissions, and he was asked by Mary Gaudron from the bench a question, and this was the question. She said, tell me, Solicitor, as I understand it, your position is this, that from the time when sovereignty was claimed in 1879, the Murray Islanders were, in a legal sense, trespassers on Crown land, and they could at any time have been driven off the land into the sea. Is that your position? And the Queensland Solicitor General said, yes, I guess that's what it is. So, did Eddie Mabo own the land, or was Eddie Mabo's family merely been trespassers, permissive trespassers, since 1879? And that was the critical issue which the High Court had to decide. Now, as we know, the High Court found for Mabo and others against the state of Queensland. And what they essentially said in terms of sovereignty was that, yes, in 1879, the Crown, Queensland and the Crown gained the sovereignty over the Murray Islands. They gained the right to govern, to rule. They had the sovereignty over those islands. But they didn't become the owners of all the property. The property ownership remained in the hands of the Murray Islanders, and nothing the Queensland government has done between 1879 and the present has taken that property right away. And that perhaps was another critical point. A claim of sovereignty did not take away the property rights of people living on the land. Now that is why the High Court applied the principles of Mabo to the rest of Australia. Because if a claim of sovereignty in 1879 didn't take away the Indigenous property rights, neither did the claims of sovereignty in 1788, in 1824 and 1829. The 4 claims of sovereignty made over parts of Australia did not by themselves wipe out pre-existing property rights. Now that, in a sense, was a revolution in white Australian thinking.
because it had been assumed that either there was no land rights there at all, or they'd been wiped out instantly when sovereignty was claimed. So that's the first way in which we can contrast native title and terra nullius. Native title says, yes, these people continued to own their property and have done so up to the present, according to their own traditions. Terra nullius said either they had no rights, or if they did, they were wiped out when we claimed the islands for the Queen. Let me move on to the second question, and that is the question of land use. The question of land use, because this is also a critical point. Many of the conservative critics of the High Court have said, well, all right, we can appreciate that these Murray Islanders, they owned the land because they had lived in villages and they were gardeners and they had nice plots of land and they actually dug the soil and planted crops. We can understand, we accept, yes, native title in Murray Island. But the court was quite wrong, criminally wrong, some of them are virtually saying, to extend these principles to the rest of Australia, because the societies were, quite obviously, had differences. So the question of land use is also important, and perhaps this is critically significant now because the two principles are embodied in two competing bits of legislation, the Federal Bill and the Western Australian Bill. They are premised on the two different principles. The Federal Bill is premised on native title, Mr. Court's bill is premised on terra nullius. Let me explain what the Western Australian Bill intends to do. Firstly, it extinguishes native title throughout Western Australia. It extinguishes native title throughout Western Australia. It accepts that it existed, as the High Court said so in the common law, but it extinguishes native title straight, right out. It's gone. In its place, and virtually in the same clause of the bill, Section 7, Clause 7, it says it establishes a right of customary usage by that bill, as they say, a statutory right of customary usage. And the Western Australian government, and unfortunately a significant percentage of the Western Australian population, believes that that is a fair exchange. That it takes with one hand native title, bang, is gone, but it gives statutory rights in another, and that's a fair exchange. Well, of course, it is anything but. Statutory rights relate entirely to what they see as traditional usage. That is, a very limited number of things can be done. Hunting, gathering, drinking water. It is not a use to land at all. It is not a right to land at all. It is a right to do certain things on the land. And only a very limited number of things. You presumably can't modernise your usage. You can only use it for quote-unquote traditional means. All other legal interests, including mining leases, will wipe out those rights, customary usage rights, and they can be extinguished at will by a minister at any time or an official as long as a few days' notice is given. In other words, what is being offered are very, very lesser rights than the federal legislation, and they are very, very vulnerable. They can be wiped out almost at will. Now, underlying this is, as I say, the principles of terra nullius. Let me explain why. What the Western Australian government basically is premised on, and here I move, as I say, I move on to a slightly different point, is that in Western Australia they accept that there are many people who are still living on their traditional lands. They accept that, they know that. But what they are saying is that although these people have been on the lands, occupying the lands, for all this vast length of time, they have never been able to establish any property rights in the land. All they have are the rights to make some use of the land. But the bill specifically says these are not property rights of any sort. In other words, they go back to that old idea that nomadic people who weren't living in villages or who weren't located, as they said in past times, who were not using the soil, could not establish, no matter how long they were there, a property interest, a proprietary interest in the land. All they could achieve, no matter how long, how many hundreds of generations, all they would achieve in that time would be the right to continue to hunt and gather over the land. So that is what native title isn't. That is the principles that are embodied in that piece of legislation, which is a massive piece of expropriation. Make no mistake about it. It is a massive piece of expropriation. And of course, that touches on very much the principal right-wing, one of the principal right-wing attacks on the High Court, that they made the mistake of trying to bring native title to mainland Australia because Aborigines, everyone knows, were nomadic and therefore could establish no property rights in the soil. And that, once again, is a critical point. So the question of whether a claim of sovereignty took away property rights is critical. The question of what property rights Indigenous people could establish if they did not have agriculture, if they were hunters and gatherers and moved from place to place in their own territory. So let's move on then to the third question. I've dealt with sovereignty and land use. I've touched on to some extent, but let me move on to this question of property. Now, the Murray Islanders were judged by the High Court as having the right against the world to the occupation, possession, use and enjoyment of the Murray Islands. The occupation and possession, that is, we're talking about real property rights, possession, a form of ownership. And native title can indeed be a form of ownership approaching the ordinary rights of people who have freehold. It can approach that, although based on local traditions. Now, native title, although this is not understood, and some of the legal luminaries in Brisbane who claim expertise in this area are quite frankly totally ignorant in that they say native title can't apply to people like Aborigines. Now that is fundamentally wrong. Native title is a doctrine that was based on possession. And possession in the law, in both English and international law, at the time Australia was being settled, to establish possession you had to have three things. You had to be on the land, that is, you had to walk over the land, you had to be there. Secondly, you had to take your living from the land, you had to use it economically. And thirdly, you had to, by various signs, show you believed the land was yours, either by keeping trespassers off or by naming the land or having a spiritual association with it. You had to show the will to possess it. They were the three things. And as we've seen in North America, that has always been the case. The hunting grounds of Indians were always considered as being held by native title. And in the recent years, native title has been accepted as occurring right across the frozen north, Alaska, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, that vast area where quite clearly people didn't grow crops. But there's been no doubt in North America, not since the 18th century, that people who lived by hunting and gathering and other use of the land that wasn't agriculture, nevertheless had some form of right, of property right in that land. So in that sense, the High Court was absolutely correct in saying the principles we've established for Murray Island also apply to the rest of Australia. And those, as I say, those legal conservatives who say the High Court was wrong in this simply haven't bothered to read up the law in question. Well, I've dealt with sovereignty, land use and property. Let me come on to the question of traditional association. Where does native title actually come from? What is this traditional association?